When you retire, you may get a chance to go to football heaven. This is football heaven.
Hey guys, welcome to a special mission podcast. I'm your host, Jameer Howerton, and I am so pumped for this podcast because it's breaking news here in Canton, Ohio. That's right, guys. It's that time of year again when we start on our road to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And helping me break down the breaking news is no other than one of the 49 Pro Football Hall of Fame selectors, and he is also the 2022 Bill Nunn Award winner from the USA Today. Mr. Jarrett Bell is joining us right here on The Mission. Mr. Bell, welcome to The Mission, sir.
Jameer, it's great to be here, man. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Well, as you know, we have breaking news coming out of Canton, Ohio. The list of modern era nominees for the 2023 class of the Pro Football Hall of Fame has been broken down to 28. As you can see, 2023 is the second round, and there are 28 players. You guys went from 129 to 28. Before we really dive into this long list of 28 players, I have to ask you, can you take us through the process to educate so our viewers and listeners can learn about this amazing process?
Yeah, I mean, it actually starts every year, after the previous year ends. I mean, it's almost a year-round cycle when it comes to voting for the Hall of Fame, because you've got different committees and different categories. But for this one, we'll get a preliminary list. I want to say it's around June, maybe it's May. And when we get that preliminary list, it'll kind of like be, okay, if anybody has anybody else they want to add to the list, any of the selectors have someone else that they want to nominate, do it now before we have this final list. And then we'll get the final list. And then we'll, like you said, we'll have that vote. I want to say sometime in August, and then we'll go to September, and then we'll parse it down to where we are now. And then we go another couple rounds, because we go from here to 15 finalists, and then from 15 finalists to the final class of 2023.
There's so many interesting stories that I know that you can share, but just when you go from 129 of the greatest that have ever played the game, and there's so many other great ones that may not have made that list, but then you go down to 28, how challenging is that for you guys and you and your colleagues to do this job?
Yeah, it's a difficult thing, because like you said, there are a lot of deserving candidates. And even if you can, make an argument for one guy versus another, quite often it can be, very challenging to compare guys at certain positions, guys from different eras. Maybe a guy that I saw when I was, in my 20s, and I know he was a good player back in the 80s and a great player back in the 80s. And then you try to compare him to somebody who played in 2005 or something. That can be a challenging thing, because you also are always cognizant of what the circumstances were for any given player. And by that, I mean, what team did he play for? Who was he coached by? How successful were they? Because you also have players who are great players that never end up playing on great teams, and they could be overshadowed in this whole process as well. So there's a lot to chew on when it comes to that. It's a never-ending cycle, no doubt about it.
All right, Mr. Bell, let's jump into it, and let's look at this list of 28. When you look at this list, what are a couple of things that jump out to you?
Well, the first thing is the fact that it's 28. We were supposed to cut down to 25, but in this round, the hall will allow for ties. And so I think a couple of years ago, we may have had 26 or 27, but this year, 28. And I think that really speaks to what I was talking about a minute ago, how challenging it can be to compare one guy versus another, because you've got, very many deserving candidates. It's like, okay, how do I pick this guy versus that guy? And so when you've got 49 people going through the same thing, and unlike what will happen in the final round, when we will all be on a Zoom call, which we've done the last couple of years, but before that we were in a room the day before the Super Bowl, but now we're on a big long Zoom call before the Super Bowl. But the point being, that's the first time that we're all together where we really can debate it amongst the other 49. Now, in the process between now and then, you may run into some of your colleagues in the press box. You may pick up the phone. We'll have email exchanges, things like that. But when we get to that final voting, that's when everyone is together, and that's when it gets to be a little bit more of a debate. But the point being here, 28 tells me that we had a lot of tough decisions, and it really speaks to the strength of this class. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens as we go from here. If we get to 15, or will they come back and say, well, we've got 17 finalists instead of 15, which is possible as well.
You know, when we get this list, my colleagues and I, we typically look at and see what position group dominates. And for me, and I know you could speak better to this, I look and I see wide receivers, linebackers, and also too, you start to look at who are the kind of the first time semifinalists as well.
Yeah, because the first ballot guys are always interesting, because sometimes, a lot of times they'll come in and they'll jump right to the front of the line. And I'm not one, from my own philosophy as a voter, that feels like, I've got to go with some recency bias, just because the guy's in for the first time, that he may be worthy and you may see him as a Hall of Famer, but you may also see a guy who's been waiting for 3 or 4 years and you think he's a legitimate Hall of Famer as well. So those are the types of dilemmas that you run into. But for this year's class, I look at, Jari Evans, Dwight Freeney, James Harrison, who I love as a candidate, Darrelle Revis. I mean, these are first ballot guys who, if they got in on the first ballot, you would say, yeah, they're very deserving. But we'll see how it shakes down when you go in this whole thing with 28. So first ballot guys, strong guys, because I thought DeMarcus Ware, for example, as a first ballot guy last year would get in. I really did. Now he's back in the mix again. So there's a James Harrison, for example, jumped the line in front of a DeMarcus Ware. I mean, both of those guys are great, right? So we'll see how that shakes down.
And Jarrett, I know all of Northeast Ohio is praying, fingers crossed, and you name it, for Mr. Joe Thomas, because he is the first time on this list as well.
Yeah. I was remiss. I've got him marked on this thing. I didn't even mention him, but that's another guy. And you talk about him as, I don't know how many Pro Bowls is it, 10, 11, 12, whatever. He has definitely earned his right to be that guy. But again, it's a big process. We just saw Tony Baselli get into the Hall of Fame, even though Baselli's career compared to Thomas's was a bit different because it wasn't as long, but it took a long time for Tony Baselli to get into the Hall of Fame. I don't know if it's going to take Joe Thomas that long, but again, you put him in this mix where you've got so many people, and you talked about it a minute ago. You've got 8 wide receivers. I think that's really, one of the more compelling things on this list too, because we had a logjam a few years ago with receivers, and we had a tough time putting any of them in. And then we ended up putting like 3 in a row. And I think this was, Andre Reed and Tim Brown and that sort of thing. So we may have that again, where one receiver survives out of this, or you can have multiple ones. But the point being that, you got to make that decision as a voter. And then we're all going to have to do it together. Like Torrey Holt versus Steve Smith and Reggie Wayne and Hines Ward. Sometimes it could be a matter of whether you like vanilla or chocolate, because the stats don't always, justify one vote or another. The stats are important because we're talking about productivity. But as I mentioned a minute ago, sometimes it gets to be a matter of, okay, well, who did he play with? Who was his quarterback? Or what was their offensive scheme like? And what other things did he do outside of the receiver? Like you look at a guy like Anquan Bolden, one of my favorite players just from watching over the years. And Not so much that he put up fancy big time stats. His stats were good, but he was a complete receiver and he came through in the clutch. So you start thinking about things like that. And then, I say that about Anquan Bolden, and I'm sure Reggie Wayne could sit there and say, well, what about me? Because I was a clutch guy too. And so that's what we have to deal with. And Lordy Lord, we'll be going through this again.
I do not envy you and your 48 other colleagues. And as I'm listening, sir, it sounds like, unfortunately, due to the system, players unfortunately get overlooked. And with that being said, when you look at this list, are there guys that you may feel that have been overlooked over the course of the years?
Yeah. Let me give you 3 names that I'm glad to see on this list. 1, Eric Allen. 2, London Fletcher. Here's a guy who was overlooked. And 3, Albert Lewis. Now, quickly about each of those guys. So London Fletcher was an Iron Man. He played 16 years in the NFL as a linebacker, and he never missed a game, right? London Fletcher came from a Division III school, John Carroll, and ended up being a Super Bowl champion and having this enormous career as a linebacker in the NFL. But he also was overshadowed coming into the league, overshadowed when he was in the league. And now here he is. We're talking about him maybe not being overshadowed ultimately, but not being a guy when you look at the linebackers list, you're probably going to say, well, what about this guy that got that? So it's still going to be a challenge for him to get in over some other people. But we saw Sam Mills get in last year or year before, and I think London Fletcher is that same kind of player, even though I think if you look at the statistics, he's got even more statistics than Sam Mills, if you will. And so even though Mills played in the USFL too, so you consider that. But I say that to say, you look at this guy, you look at Albert Lewis as another guy who is in the final year of his eligibility, like Mills was. That was the thing that I think pushed Mills over the top, is that once we got to the point where we're saying, okay, it's either now or never, or he goes into that seniors pool, which could mean waiting another 20 years. And so that's where Albert Lewis is now in relation to that. I mean, Albert Lewis is a guy who was not only a great cornerback, and Jerry Rice called Albert Lewis like the toughest cornerback that he ever played against. I mean, think about that. Jerry Rice, for all the people that he played against, all the different schemes that they designed to try to stop him, he pointed to Albert Lewis as that guy. I think that's big props. Tony Dungy gives Albert Lewis great props, says that he was as good of a man-to-man cover as Rod Woodson and Mike Haynes. And so, very, very strong credentials for Albert Lewis, but he's never really been in this position where we've talked about him as like a finalist. He's a semifinalist now. So that's a guy who has been overlooked. And oh, by the way, he only blocked like 11 punts in his career. So you talk about, if it was just the special teams, he'd already be in the Hall of Fame because he was one of the great specialists. And then Eric Allen is another guy who's been overlooked. I mean, he never made all decade, but he was that shutdown corner for one of the best defenses of NFL history. You're talking about Gang Green with Buddy Ryan and Reggie White and the Philadelphia Eagles. Well, Eric Allen was back there on that back end, but like I said, never made all decade, overlooked because you got Reggie White up in front of you and Clyde Simmons, but you've got also some other great corners who got all of the accolades when Eric Allen, Deion Sanders and Darryl Green and Rod Woodson. So Eric Allen might feel like he's been overlooked before and now here again, but at least he's advanced now in this process. I think this is the 3rd year in a row he's been a semifinalist, and that's a guy to keep an eye on. But again, yeah, those are some of the tough decisions that we have to deal with, but that's why we're on this committee, I think, is to really try to, understand what's fair and parse through some of these situations.
This is amazing. You just way you're breaking it down, and I hope our viewers are enjoying this rich conversation about this whole process, because it's like I said, I don't envy you and your colleague's job at all. But one thing we do know, Mr. Bell, is that the finalists for the coach contributor legendary coach Don Coryell is already a finalist. And we know for the senior class, the 3 players, Chuck Howley, Joe Klecko, and Ken Riley. If you can explain that process and how they're just kind of waiting, because everybody, I think, kind of like you said, we see the 129 of the modern era players, and we're waiting to see this list of 28 and what shapes out of that. But they're great men, as you mentioned, that are waiting in the wings as well.
Yeah, and so what we have are 2 subcommittees. One for coaches and contributors. I'm on that subcommittee. There's like 12 of us on that committee. It used to be 5 of us, but they've expanded that committee. And pretty much like we do with the normal committee, we'll have a slate of candidates and then we'll whittle it down and then we'll get together and talk and then select one for coach or contributor. Seniors committee, same deal. They've got like 12 people on their committee, 10 or 12 people on their committee. But I think it's a lot more difficult. And I think it's tough enough for coaches and contributors, because I think it's tough to compare, say, Robert Kraft against Mike Shanahan, a coach versus a team owner, or John Wooten against Mike Holmgren. But anyway, we came up with Don Coryell this year, a guy who we had talked about before as an innovator. And even though he didn't have the greatest playoff success, but a guy who definitely left a mark on the league. The seniors committee, it's even tougher, Jameer, because we talk about a guy like Albert Lewis being in his last year of eligibility as a modern era candidate. Well, if he doesn't make it, then he goes into the seniors pool. And the seniors pool could mean waiting another 10, 20, 25 years, because there's such a backlog of candidates that are there that you're trying to determine. And I think the one good thing that's happened with the Hall in recent years is that we have expanded the senior nominees that get to go to the full board to 3 now. Used to be 1, it's been 2, now it's 3 candidates, and maybe that will help, alleviate some of that backlog. But tell that to a guy who's been waiting for the Hall of Fame for 25 years, and it still hasn't had his number called. But same sort of process. You go through it, they cut it down, they debate it, and then, they vote, accordingly. But I think the one thing you could say, Jameer, is for any of these candidates who become Hall of Famers, to get through the process, to get through the ringer, and to go through all of these levels, there are no gimmies. Nobody gets in without really being fully vetted and without deserving it. And you talk about what they deserve for what they did on the field, or with their impact in the game. Yeah, I think that's obvious to get to this point. But then to get through this process with all this vetting, it's another thing. And the frustrating thing that has to be there for some of the candidates is the fact that there's really nothing they can do. They've done all they can do. They've played every game. They've coached every game. They've done what they might do as a contributor, and then it's left up to other people. I know that could be real difficult when you are someone who, feels like you control what you do with your effort and your performance. Well, when it comes to the Hall of Fame, it's pretty much now in someone else's, the committee's hands. And I know that could be a real difficult thing. So I really, have a lot of empathy for the players and the coaches and other people associated with the game who are under consideration.
Super competitive men. I mean, I was blessed to work for 2 organizations, the New York Jets and the Cleveland Browns. And I was at the Cleveland Browns 99 to 2013 when that team came back. But before then, I was with the New York Jets from 93 to 98. So I worked with Bill Parcells. And I worked with Bill Belichick, and I worked with that whole team and Romeo Crennel. So I got a chance to see some ultra competitive men. And with that being said, Mr. Jarrett, do you think guys could campaign? Could you think they could is there a campaign? Because we see what happened to, God bless his soul, Mr. Floyd Little, when the fan went on to campaign for the franchise.
Yeah, I think it's difficult for, number one, I don't think a person should campaign for himself. I really don't. I mean, I think that's a bad look, a bit tacky, to tell you the truth. And it would rub me the wrong way if someone came to me and said, hey, I should be a Hall of Famer, put me in. Because the voters, we kind of know who should be in consideration. And maybe we can have debates about who the top 10 are, the top 20 or the top 5. Yeah, that's what we do. But in terms of who should be on that list and taken before the full committee, I don't think it does a candidate any good to do that. Now, I've talked to guys over the years who have been in that, in limbo, and I didn't feel like they were really campaigning, directly to me, although they may have had questions about how the process worked or anything like that. But that's where I really got a great sense of, how difficult it is, because if you don't get in this year, then you got a whole nother year to wait and see if I got in the next year. And so that could be a tough thing. But what can happen and what does happen in terms of the campaign aspect of it is that other people will definitely campaign on behalf of people. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It can be a bit tiresome or a bit annoying. And I say that with all due respect. It can be a bit annoying if there's a campaign for a certain person and they just really inundate the committee with letters and emails and even phone calls and videos. I mean, we've had that happen before. I think the Art Monk campaign was, enormously intense, and it ended up, I'm sure it ended up, it kept him on the radar. I don't know if that's what really put him over, because some voters will tell you that if there's too much campaigning, it almost turns them off. So there's still that human element to it. But I think the kind of campaigning that I think is really helpful is if a player comes out and he may endorse a candidate, many times a former teammate, and they can give you some perspective about what this guy was like to play with. But I'm even more impressed when, Tom Brady sends a letter to the committee and says, hey, Jason Taylor was a beast, okay? That's what really kind of gets me to thinking, because it's like, okay, he didn't play with this guy. You can see if Tom Brady is stumping for, Adam Vinatieri, right? Yeah, okay, they played together. But to come out and say, hey, really consider this guy who was one of my opponents, I think that speaks volumes for that particular person's candidacy. So that's one example of something that's happened in recent years. But, I don't even know if I'd call that a campaign. But when you talk about all of the communication that we get as, committee members from people, I think that does carry some weight.
In other words, patience is a virtue.
Yeah.
Gotta be patient. You gotta be patient. Because like you said, if you put the time in and you put the work in, it'll show for itself.
Yeah. It's easy for you and me to say that.
Yeah.
Let's acknowledge that.
Right. So I guess what's next in the process? I know, just to put a bow on this. So we're at 28. We know the contributor, coach. We know the seniors. So now you guys go right before the week of the Super Bowl, and really, it gets hot and heavy.
No, well, actually, we've got another cut down coming.
Okay.
So we'll have another. We'll get our next ballot, and the cut down will be sometime in early to mid-December.
Okay.
And then we'll get our list of finalists from there. So we'll cut from 28 to 15. Okay. And then when we get to 15, yeah, it might get a little more, it definitely will be more intense, because now you're down to the 15 and because say, even if there's someone here on the list of 28 that you feel strongly about, well, if they don't make it to 15, then now as a voter, you may have to just, recalibrate your thinking. Well, okay, I wanted this linebacker to get in. He didn't get in. Okay, so now what do I think in terms of who in what kind of pecking order? I mean, that's kind of how you go through some of this. But when we get to that week before the Super Bowl, yeah, there'll be a lot more discussion. And then, like I said, that big meeting when everyone is there as well. But I think the one thing that I know I do as a voter is when we get to 15, I'll take it to people who I really respect, whose opinions and that includes existing Hall of Famers. I'll lean on those men a whole lot, just in terms of for their insight into people. And some, Warren Sapp being one, are not shy about telling you what they think to make sure that you know what they think, which is okay in the spirit of everything. Just, you want information, you want insight. But that's one of the things that I'll do as a voter is I'll go to coaches and personnel people and players and really just try and even other media people who may not be on the committee and just get opinions and just try to build my base of knowledge about people. But yeah, the one thing that also happens, Jameer, you think about it, I've been on the committee for like 25 years, right?
Yep.
And, others not been on the committee that long, but long enough to where a lot of the material, a lot of the arguments, a lot of the insight carries over from year to year. So just to throw a name out, Rondé Barber. I've heard about Rondé Barber now 4, 5, 6 years in a row. So I've got a good idea about who Rondé Barber is. And it's not like you're starting from scratch every year with these candidates. And so, a lot of the intel, if you will carry over.
And lastly, this list could potentially, the final list could potentially be 9 Hall of Famers.
Yeah. Hey, I think when you talk about, how big the classes are,
right?
I think that's kind of where we are right now. I really do. And part of the reason is when you think about the history of the National Football League starting in 1920 and the Hall of Fame starting in 1963, right? So you're talking like 43 years before you had a Hall of Fame. And so a lot of those early classes address the Hall of Famers from those early years. And now as the years have gone on, the league has expanded, there's more teams. I think that's kind of part of the whole competition that we have, not only with the modern eras, but definitely with the seniors as well, is that there's so many good players that have come along that it's tough to kind of catch everybody in some of these classes. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have this backlog. But by the same token, the Hall of Fame should be tough to get into. It should be for the best of the best. Just because you're all decade doesn't mean you're automatically a Hall of Famer. It means you were all decade. Great. Even if you were all pro for 2 years, it doesn't mean you're a Hall of Famer. It means you were all pro for, the year 1999 and the year 2000 or whatever. Okay. So I think some of the things that we talk about when we try to compare some of these deals, it really has to, have that full context. But again, part of that context is the fact that 1963, the Hall of Fame was established and the league had already been in existence for 40 something years.
Wow. Well, Mr. Bell, we want to thank you so much. And on behalf of your colleagues here at the Pro Football Hall of Fame and the Mission Podcast, we want to wish you and yours a happy Thanksgiving, sir.
I appreciate that, Jameer. It will be happy. And some football will be in the middle of that too.
Hey, I got to say that, and I said this before, but I hope the viewers who are watching could really see, as I say, USA Today, Mr. Jarrett Bell. I love that USA,
the
newspaper box right there.
Yes.
That's a throwback, man. I love that.
Yeah, it's a classic. I live in Georgia, and I was driving through Georgia a few weeks ago and stopped at a gas station in a rural town in South Georgia. And lo and behold, I saw one of those that's still, we changed out the newsstands like years ago. And nowadays with everything online, you just don't see them, any kind of newsstands, but they actually had an old school USA Today newsstand, and it was still functioning. It was,
wow. That's sweet.
So I was like, wow,
That's
I didn't know they had these. I thought they took them all up, but anyway, so I got one.
That's great. That's great. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jarrett Bell right here on The Mission.
Thank you.